In 1907, he was the only one who returned from the forest after 3 months, and when he came back, his boots were dry, despite 3 days of unrelenting rain. Somewhere tonight, in whatever room you're sitting in, whatever hour the clock above you reads, consider what it means to walk out of something that swallowed everyone else whole. Consider what a man carries when he is the only one who comes back. And consider what he might choose to put into the ground rather than speak aloud. This is not a ghost story. It is something quieter and perhaps more unsettling than that. The year was 1907. The place was Harlan County, Kentucky. Not the Harlan County of legend, not yet the one that would become synonymous with coal wars and labor blood. This was an earlier version of that place, a county still half swallowed by the Cumberland Mountains, where the tree line pressed so close to town that on certain mornings in late October, the forest seemed to have moved in the night. Timber was the economy. Timber was the language. And in the autumn of that year, a surveying expedition of 7 men entered the Blackwell Tract, approximately 40,000 acres of old-growth forest that a Cincinnati land company had recently purchased and was preparing to clear. The 7 men were not explorers. They were working professionals. 2 surveyors from Lexington, a cartographer named Ellison Pruitt, who had done similar work in Tennessee, a local guide named Calvin Doss, 2 axemen, and their expedition leader, a man by the name of Robert Elias Marin. Marin was 34 years old. He had been born in Harlan County, moved to Cincinnati at 19, trained as a civil engineer, and returned to eastern Kentucky in 1903 after his wife died in childbirth. He was described in contemporaneous records as methodical, quiet, and well-regarded. His former employer, the Colby Land Survey Company, listed him in internal correspondence as one of our most reliable men in difficult terrain. He had completed 7 prior expeditions without incident. On October 3, 1907, the 7 men entered the Blackwell Tract from its southwestern boundary. They were expected to return within 3 weeks. They had food for 30 days, equipment for mapping approximately 18 square miles, and a clear set of objectives. Nobody who watched them go in had any reason to expect anything other than ordinary difficulty. Rough terrain, early frost, the usual friction of men working in close quarters under physical strain. They did not return in 3 weeks. They did not return in 4. By late November, when the first hard snow closed the mountain passes, a search party of 12 men was organized by the county sheriff, a man named Aldous Trent. The search party entered the forest on November the 22nd and spent 9 days combing the southwestern quadrant of the Blackwell Tract. They found a campsite, partially collapsed. They found equipment, some of it deliberately stacked, some of it scattered across a wide radius in a manner the searchers found difficult to explain. They found no bodies. They found no clear trail of exit. And after 9 days, with conditions deteriorating and 2 members of the search party suffering from exposure, Sheriff Trent ordered the group back to Harlan. The expedition was declared lost. A formal report was filed with the county and with the Cincinnati Land Company. Letters were sent to the families of all 7 men. Plans were made quietly to eventually recover what equipment could be salvaged in the spring. Robert Elias Marin walked out of the forest on January the 8th, 1908. He had been missing for 97 days. He came out at the northeastern boundary of the tract, a full 12 miles from where the expedition had entered. He was found by a farmer named Hugh Sizemore, who was breaking ice on his creek at first light, when he saw a figure emerge from the tree line and stop at the edge of the field. Sizemore later told Sheriff Trent that the man stood at the tree line for what felt like several minutes before stepping forward, that he did not look injured, that he did not call out, that he simply walked across the field toward the farmhouse as though arriving from an ordinary errand. Sizemore did not immediately recognize Marin. The man had lost what was later estimated to be 40 pounds. His beard had grown dense and uneven. His clothing, the same clothing he had entered the forest in 3 months prior, was worn, but not destroyed. His boots were intact. When Sizemore brought him inside, Marin sat at the kitchen table and accepted a cup of coffee and drank it without speaking for nearly 20 minutes. Sizemore's wife later recalled that his hands did not shake. that he did not appear frightened or disoriented, that his eyes, she said, were perfectly clear, like a man who had thought something through completely. She told the county physician when he arrived. His name, when he finally gave it, was offered without explanation or preamble. He said, "I am Robert Marin. I was with the Blackwell survey." He then asked about the date. When Sizemore told him it was January 8th, Marin looked at the table surface for a long moment, nodded once, and said nothing further. Dr. Clarence Witt, the county physician, examined Marin that afternoon. His formal notes, which survive in partial form in the Harlan County Historical Archive, describe a man in surprisingly stable physical condition. Malnourished, certainly. Some evidence of frostbite on 2 toes of the left foot, already healing. A deep laceration on his right forearm, several weeks old, closed and scarred without medical intervention. No signs of acute illness. No signs of cognitive impairment as assessed by the standard methods of the period. Witt noted that Marin answered all direct questions, clearly and without hesitation, and that his memory of dates and basic facts appeared intact. He asked Marin what had happened to the other 6 men. Marin told him that they were dead. He did not elaborate. Witt noted that when pressed for details, Marin said only that the expedition encountered severe difficulty beginning approximately 2 weeks in, and that he alone had been able to continue. He did not say how the others had died. He did not say where their bodies were. He did not display, in Witt's clinical observation, what the physician described as the emotional presentation one would expect from a man who had witnessed the deaths of 6 companions. This was the first sign that something was wrong, not dramatically wrong, not visibly wrong in a way that compelled immediate action, but the absence of grief, or rather the presence of something that occupied the same space as grief but functioned differently, was noted. Witt wrote in his report that Marin was cooperative but remote, and that he seemed to possess a quality of deliberate composure that went somewhat beyond ordinary stoicism. Marin was transported back to Harlan. He was given a room at the boarding house of a woman named Clara Oakes, where he had lived before the expedition. He met with Sheriff Trent twice in the following week. Both meetings were recorded by a deputy, and portions of those transcripts were later preserved. Trent asked Marin, over the course of those 2 sessions, to provide a full account of events in the Blackwell tract. Marin declined to give one. He said that he had given the matter considerable thought, and that he did not believe a detailed account would serve any useful purpose. When Trent pressed him, the deaths of 6 men was, after all, a matter of legal record. Marin acknowledged this, but said simply that the cause of their deaths was the wilderness itself, and nothing in my testimony would change that or help their families. Trent, by all accounts a practical and fair-minded official, did not push the matter past a certain point. The forest had taken men before. The mountain counties of Kentucky in 1907 were not places where authority had the luxury of pursuing every ambiguity to its conclusion. The 6 men were dead. That, legally, was the case as it stood. No charges were filed, no inquest was opened. The Cincinnati Land Company accepted a brief written statement from Marin and closed its internal inquiry. What happened next, in the weeks following Marin's return, was documented not in any official record, but in the ordinary accumulated observations of people who lived near him and remembered him. Clara Oakes told her daughter decades later that Marin would wake between 2 and 4 in the morning almost every night, that she heard him, not crying, not in distress, but moving, walking the length of his room, slowly, back and forth, sometimes for an hour, sometimes until dawn. She never heard him speak aloud in these nocturnal hours. She never heard anything she could call distress, just the measured sound of a man walking in the dark. His appetite, initially poor, recovered within several weeks, but he ate, multiple witnesses noted, with an unusual attention to completeness, consuming everything on his plate in full regardless of the quantity, eating slowly and methodically, as if the act required his careful management. A neighbor named Bert Colley, who sometimes shared Sunday dinner at the boarding house, told his son that watching Marin eat was like watching a man who had made a decision about food and was keeping to it. He did not speak of the forest unprompted. Not once, by any account preserved from that period, did Marin volunteer information about those 97 days. He returned to civil engineering work in the spring of 1908, accepting a modest contract with a local coal company. He was, by all professional accounts, as competent as he had ever been. Careful, reliable, quiet. He purchased a small house on the eastern edge of Harlan in the summer of 1908 and moved out of Clara Oakes's boarding house. The house sat on 1/3 of an acre. Behind it, the property sloped down to a narrow creek, and along that slope stood several old apple trees long unpruned. The neighbors who lived closest to that house, a family named Gillum, noticed in the late autumn of 1908 that Marin had dug something in the yard behind the house. This was not, in itself, unusual. People buried things, root vegetables, preserves, objects that needed cold storage. But the Gillum family's eldest son, a boy of about 14 named Thomas, told his parents that he had watched Marin work from the fence line on a Sunday morning, and that Marin had dug for what seemed a very long time, and that what he placed in the ground was wrapped in canvas, and that when Marin finished and covered the hole and tamped the earth flat, he stood over the spot for a long time without moving. Thomas Gillum said that Marin's posture during those minutes was not that of a man performing a task. It was, he said, in the way that a 14-year-old sometimes finds words that adults would not, like a man saying goodbye to someone who could not hear him. The Gillums did not investigate. It was not their land. Whatever Robert Marin chose to place in the earth behind his house was his own business, and Harlan County in 1908 was a place where a man's private business was, more often than not, respected as such. But the question persisted quietly, in the way such things do in small communities. The 6 men who had entered the Blackwell tract had never been recovered. Their families, in Lexington, in Cincinnati, in Harlan itself, had received no closure beyond the county's bare administrative acknowledgement of their deaths. Calvin Doss, the local guide, had left behind a wife and 3 children. His widow, a woman named Pearl Doss, had tried twice through informal channels to speak with Marin. Both times, he had declined to meet with her. He had sent her money, a modest but not insignificant sum, delivered anonymously, though she identified him as the source. But he had not explained to her how her husband had died or where his body lay. This was the detail that the community found hardest to set down, not the fact of the burial, not the nighttime walking, not even the guarded silence around those 97 days. It was the specific refusal to speak to Pearl Doss, a man who had worked alongside her husband for 3 months, who had somehow survived when Calvin had not, who sent her money in apparent acknowledgement of something, and who would not sit across a table from her and tell her what she most needed to hear. There is a document in the Kentucky State Library and Archives in Frankfort, filed under Miscellaneous County Correspondence from 1911, that bears Robert Marin's name. It is a letter he wrote to the State Land Office in connection with a surveying certification he was renewing. The letter is largely technical, concerned with professional qualifications, but at its close, in a postscript that has no obvious administrative purpose, Marin wrote the following: I would note that the Blackwell tract in Harlan County should, in my professional opinion, not be entered without full knowledge of the terrain in its northeastern sections. The area presents difficulties that are not apparent from any existing map, and that a surveying crew of standard composition would not be equipped to manage. It is a strange note, not dramatic, not explicit, but Marin had been the one who made those maps. He had spent 3 months in that terrain, and what he described as unmappable difficulty, he, the cartographer's colleague, the trained engineer, the man who had come out alive, was something he had chosen to communicate to a bureaucratic office rather than to the families of the men who had not come out at all. No one from the land office ever followed up on the notation. The Blackwell tract was logged commercially in 1912 and again in 1919. No timber crew during those operations reported any anomalous conditions. The forest kept whatever it had. Robert Marin died in March of 1923 at the age of 50. The cause was listed as pneumonia, compounded by what his attending physician described as general constitutional debility, a vague formulation that suggested, without specifying, that Marin's body had been giving way for some time. He left no will. He left no journal, or none that was found. He had never married again after his first wife's death. When the house was cleared by a cousin who came from Cincinnati to settle the modest estate, the cousin, a man named Paul Welch, reportedly asked a neighbor whether there was anything in the yard he should know about. The neighbor, who had heard the old Gillum story secondhand, mentioned the burial behind the house. Paul Welch looked at the backyard and decided not to dig. Whether out of respect, or lack of interest, or something harder to name, a reluctance to find out, the earth behind Robert Marin's house was not disturbed. What was wrapped in that canvas is not known. It remains unknown. Several historians who have examined the Harlan County records from this period have offered their interpretations. The most measured of these suggest that Marin, having survived a catastrophic failure of an expedition by means he found impossible to articulate in socially acceptable terms, choices made under extreme duress, decisions that allowed one man to live while others could not, spent the rest of his life managing the weight of that survival in the only way available to him: the silence, the money to Pearl Doss, the postscript in a bureaucratic letter that nobody read carefully, the object in the ground. Trauma in 1907 had no clinical language. There was no framework, no treatment, no vocabulary by which Robert Marin could have explained what the Cumberland Mountains had required of him, what he had seen or done or understood about human endurance in those 97 days existed, as far as the world around him was concerned, in a register for which no translation existed. So he carried it. He organized it. He placed whatever he could not carry into the earth and stood over it and, in the observation of a 14-year-old boy who found the right words by accident, said goodbye. This is what extreme survival sometimes costs. Not the body, not always, but the part of a person that knows how to live among others without reservation, the part that can eat without thinking, sleep without ceremony, answer questions without measuring every word for what it might release. Robert Marin came back from the forest. He lived another 15 years. He worked and ate and walked in the dark and kept his own counsel and buried something. Whether the something in the ground was physical evidence of what happened in the Blackwell Tract, a personal effect, a record, a confession of some private decision, or whether it was something else entirely, something whose significance was entirely internal to the man who placed it there, is a question that cannot now be answered. But perhaps the more searching question is not what he buried. Perhaps it is this: what does a man bury, and why does he choose burial over burning? A fire destroys. Fire makes things into nothing. Burial is different. Burial is preservation. Burial means that some part of you wants the thing to still exist somewhere, below the surface, below visibility, below the reach of language, because destroying it entirely would be a kind of lie about what happened. Robert Marin did not destroy what he carried out of that forest. He put it in the ground. And somewhere beneath the eastern slope of a property in Harlan County, Kentucky, it may still be there.